Wednesday mornings on Baker Street were often quiet, but never entirely so when Sherlock Holmes was present. I, Dr. Watson, was reading a letter that had just arrived for Holmes, an invitation to speak at a prestigious club. I handed it to him, as he hummed an opera tune he had recently learned. Holmes took the letter, scanned it briefly, and abruptly placed it on the table. He didn't look at me, but stared into space, as if weaving together invisible threads of truth. "Interesting," he murmured in his familiar low, resonant tone. "The writer of this letter, a gentleman named Fitzwilliam, resides in Kensington, is a retired army officer, has an old scar on his right wrist, and is troubled by a family matter, likely a land dispute." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "Holmes, what are you talking about? This letter is merely a standard invitation. Not a single word mentions the army, a scar, or a land dispute." Holmes's lips curled into a faint, almost mocking yet supremely confident smile. "Watson, you read only what is written. I read what is left behind. Look," he said, pointing to the letter with his slender finger. "The ink is from a Parker fountain pen, high quality, but there's a slight variation in shading between the first F of Fitzwilliam and the final G of distinguished." I peered at the letter, but could discern no difference. "I see nothing, Holmes." "Of course, Watson, because your eyes merely look, they do not observe," Holmes replied coolly. "The difference is subtle, indicating a pause, perhaps to think, and the pen was re-dipped in ink. A very instinctive movement, very military. A trained officer ensures perfection, even in the smallest actions." He continued, without waiting for me to process this. "Secondly, at the bottom left corner of the envelope, there's a faint indentation, almost imperceptible, shaped like a crest. It's the emblem of the Royal Fusilier Regiment, a unit that served in India years ago. A veteran often has a habit of engraving their unit's crest onto personal items, and he likely pressed his signet ring onto the envelope while writing." Holmes lightly flipped the letter over. "And finally, there's a faint stain on the edge of the paper. Not coffee or tea, but the residue of an anti-inflammatory ointment, commonly used for old, painful scars." Combining these three clues, the military precision in the handwriting, the old regimental crest, and the trace of ointment, leads to one conclusion: a retired army officer grappling with a personal issue, likely a long-standing matter causing both physical and mental distress. I sat in silence, utterly captivated. He hadn't just read the letter. He had read the man who wrote it, his past and present. "Remarkable, Holmes," I exclaimed. "You see things none of U.S. could." Holmes gave a slight shrug. "Watson, the world is a treasure trove of information. The trouble is, most people pass through it without truly looking. To me, everything is a puzzle, a challenge. And no puzzle is without a solution, provided we know how to piece the fragments together. Now, having once again witnessed the extraordinary power of Sherlock Holmes's deduction, let us venture into the mystery of the Black Rose, where the smallest details will unlock a chilling truth." November nights in London often brought a thick blanket of fog, like a shroud concealing the city's deepest secrets. But even the biting cold and dampness couldn't extinguish the fervent glow within the familiar sitting room at 221B, Baker Street. I, Dr. John Watson, sat across from Sherlock Holmes, engrossed in a medical tome, while he, with his usual contemplative expression, intently watched the curling tendrils of smoke from his beloved clay pipe. "Watson," Holmes broke the silence with his familiar tone, yet there was something subtly different about it. "Do you believe in destiny?" I looked up, closing my book. "A rather philosophical question, Holmes." "Why do you ask?" He didn't answer directly, merely gave a faint, knowing smile. "Sometimes, seemingly random events intertwine in peculiar ways, forming a picture whose true meaning is only revealed when complete." A rapid, urgent knocking echoed from the door, shattering the quiet. It was not the knock of an ordinary visitor. Holmes set down his pipe, a spark of keen interest igniting in his eyes. "And here, perhaps, is another piece of that destiny I just mentioned." The man who entered was none other than Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his face pale, his bowler hat askew, and his overcoat damp with the night's mist. "Holmes, my God, I hope you're free. We have a case, a truly dreadful case." I looked at Holmes. His eyes, already bright, now shone even more intensely. A new drama had begun. "Tell us, Lestrade," Holmes urged, his voice surprisingly calm, a stark contrast to the inspector's agitation. "What has transpired?" Lestrade gasped for air, composing himself slightly. "It's Lady Beatrice Fairfax, Holmes. She has been murdered at her Mayfair residence. A terribly gruesome affair, discovered not long ago by the housemaid this morning." Lady Beatrice Fairfax was a prominent figure in London's high society, renowned for her wealth, philanthropic endeavors, and an invaluable collection of antique jewelry. News of her death would undoubtedly send shockwaves through the city. "Murder," Holmes repeated, his bushy eyebrows furrowing slightly. "Details, Lestrade. How do you know it was murder and not a tragic accident?" "Clear signs, Holmes. Her throat was savagely cut, almost severed, and a strange object was found right beside the body." Lestrade paused, swallowing hard, clearly still haunted by the scene. "A perfectly black rose. Utterly black, without a single trace of red." I felt a chill run down my spine. A black rose was a symbol rarely used, and in a murder case, it carried a particularly sinister meaning. "A black rose," Holmes murmured, tapping his temple with a finger, a sign that his extraordinary mind was beginning its work. Someone clearly wanted to send a message. "Precisely. But what message? The house shows no signs of forced entry, no broken windows. The safe is untouched. It seems the culprit only wanted her life, not her possessions," Lestrade said, his voice laced with confusion. "That's why I need you, Holmes. The crime scene is still sealed. We must go there immediately." Holmes rose, his dressing gown swishing gently with his movement. "Excellent, Lestrade. A mystery with a black rose. What a fascinating beginning. Watson, prepare your revolver and medical bag. We have a trip to Mayfair." The hansom cab carried us through the thick London fog, the clopping of horses' hooves and the crunch of wheels on the damp pavement forming a melancholic soundtrack to our journey to the crime scene. Not a word was spoken on the way. Lestrade still trembled from the shock, while Holmes, as usual, was lost in his own thoughts, his eyes gazing distantly as if seeing invisible things. When we arrived at the Fairfax residence in Mayfair, the area had already been cordoned off by the police. A small crowd of curious onlookers gathered beyond the railings, straining to catch a glimpse inside. The chill in the air came not only from the fog, but also from the heavy atmosphere of death. "The drawing room on the ground floor," Lestrade whispered as we entered, "where she usually read and received guests." The drawing room door was ajar, and as soon as I stepped over the threshold, I felt a chill colder than the outside air. The faint smell of blood hung in the atmosphere, mingling with a subtle scent of disinfectant and dried roses. Even though I had witnessed many dreadful sights, the scene before me still sent shivers down my spine. Lady Beatrice Fairfax lay on the luxurious Persian rug, her eyes wide open, staring up at the ceiling, seemingly still filled with horror. The cut on her throat was indeed deep and brutal, just as Lestrade had described. Right beside her right hand lay the perfectly black rose, an unnatural shade of black, as if meticulously dyed, a gruesome contrast against the deep red rug. Holmes was in no hurry. He paused at the threshold, his eyes slowly sweeping across the room, from the dying embers in the fireplace, the precious oil paintings, to the neatly arranged books on the shelves. He touched nothing, only observed. "Lestrade." Holmes spoke, his voice calm, yet commanding attention. "You said the house showed no signs of forced entry, with a front door and all windows securely locked." "Precisely, Holmes," Lestrade nodded. "Everything was sealed from the inside. The killer must have been familiar with the house, or allowed in by Lady Beatrice." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his gaze lingering on a distant point. "Interesting. Very interesting." He stepped into the room, but did not go directly to the body. Instead, he walked along the perimeter of the room, his sharp eyes missing no detail, however small. He crouched down, examining the edge of the rug, then looked up at the ceiling. I wondered, what was he pondering? A case with no forced entry, a mysterious black rose, and a victim from high society. Where would these pieces lead Holmes? Holmes continued his meticulous examination, moving with the grace of a predator, his every movement purposeful. He didn't approach the body immediately, a fact that always struck me as peculiar, yet perfectly logical in his method. For Holmes, the victim was merely one piece of a larger puzzle, and often not the most informative one. He spent several minutes near the large bay window, his gloved fingers tracing the edge of the velvet curtains. Then he moved to a small mahogany table, where a half-empty teacup and a copy of the Times lay. He bent low, his keen eyes scrutinizing the patterned wallpaper near the baseboard, almost as if searching for an invisible seam. "Lestrade," Holmes called out, not looking away from the wall. "Was there any disturbance in Lady Beatrice's routine yesterday evening? Any unexpected visitors, perhaps?" Lestrade consulted his small notebook. According to Mrs. Hudson, the housekeeper, who was quite distraught, I might add, Lady Beatrice had dinner alone at 7. After that, she usually retired to this very drawing room for reading or correspondence. No one else was expected. And the servants? Holmes pressed. Were they during the evening? The cook and housemaid live out, arriving early in the morning. Only Mrs. Hudson and a footman, George, were on duty. Mrs. Hudson claimed she went to bed around 10, and George left for his own quarters in the servants' wing shortly after, around 10:30, after ensuring all doors were locked and secured. Holmes nodded slowly, a faint hum of contemplation escaping his lips. He finally approached the body, but still did not touch it. He circled Lady Beatrice, his gaze fixed on the floor around her. Then he knelt. I watched as he carefully picked up a tiny, almost imperceptible fragment from the thick rug near the victim's left hand. He held it up to the light. It was a minuscule shard, glistening faintly. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice quiet but urgent. "Your medical bag. A pair of tweezers and a magnifying glass, if you please." I quickly handed him the requested tools. With delicate precision, Holmes used the tweezers to pick up a few more fragments from the rug. They were sparkling, almost like tiny crystals. He examined them under the magnifying glass for a long moment, a flicker of understanding passing through his eyes. "Interesting," he mused, more to himself than to us. "Very interesting indeed. These are not from the outside, nor are they common household dust. They possess a unique luminescence." He carefully placed the fragments into a small evidence envelope he produced from his waistcoat pocket. Lestrade, always a step behind, leaned closer. "What is it, Holmes?" "Some kind of glass." Holmes merely offered a cryptic smile. "Perhaps, or perhaps something far more telling. A signature, Lestrade, left by someone who was here in this very room at the moment of the deed. A signature that points not to the victim, but to the perpetrator." The air in the room seemed to thicken with unspoken questions. What had Holmes found? And how could these tiny, glittering fragments possibly be a signature? Holmes stood, his eyes still fixed on the sparkling fragments in the small envelope. It seemed he had found something immensely significant, a crucial piece of the puzzle that Lestrade and the others had entirely overlooked. He offered no further explanation, but continued his examination. He moved to the large oak writing desk in a corner of the room. On the desk lay some papers, an oil lamp, and a silver writing set. Holmes glanced over the letters, his eyes scanning them so rapidly I wondered if he truly registered their contents. "Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice thoughtful. "It appears Lady Beatrice was handling a substantial amount of correspondence. Was any of it particularly important or suspicious?" Lestrade consulted his notebook once more. "Nothing out of the ordinary, so far, Holmes. Mostly social letters or related to her charitable activities. We haven't found any threats or blackmail notes." Holmes nodded slightly, his finger gently touching a small, open ledger on the desk. This ledger, I noticed, was used for daily expenditures. "Interesting," he murmured again. "There was an unusual withdrawal at the end of yesterday." A significant sum of money was taken out. Yes, we saw that too, Lestrade said. Around £200. It seemed she was preparing for a large purchase or some donation. Holmes shook his head subtly. No, Lady Beatrice was a cautious woman. Such a large sum would not be withdrawn without a specific and immediate purpose. And in this case, there are no indications that she intended to go out or make purchases. This money was likely prepared to be paid to someone, a private transaction. He turned back to the black rose beside the body. This black rose, Lestrade, have you examined it thoroughly? Is it real or artificial? Lestrade shrugged. It's certainly real, Holmes. Although its completely black color makes it very unusual. Perhaps a rare species or specially dyed. Holmes did not reply, but he crouched down once more, carefully lifting the rose with tweezers. He brought it close to his nose, taking a deep sniff. Watson, come here. I stepped closer. Holmes offered me the rose. I detected a sweet fragrance, but it was mixed with something sharp, metallic. This scent, Holmes said, a glint in his eyes, is not merely the fragrance of a rose. There's another layer beneath it. A chemical. A very distinct chemical. I frowned. A chemical? Is it the dye? Perhaps, Holmes replied, a mysterious smile playing on his lips. Or perhaps something far more sinister. A subtle clue the killer unwittingly left behind. This clue, along with the glittering fragments we found, is beginning to tell a story. A story of betrayal and a dark secret. The tension in the room intensified. Sherlock Holmes had seen things we had not, smelled things we had not. He was slowly piecing together the clues, and I could feel that the mystery of Lady Beatrice Fairfax was about to be unveiled. Holmes, with the black rose still held delicately in his tweezers, led us away from the immediate vicinity of the body. He walked towards the large, ornate fireplace, its marble mantelpiece adorned with various trinkets. He paused, inspecting the hearth. Lestrade, Holmes began, his voice now carrying a hint of the excitement that always accompanied a promising lead. You mentioned the fireplace was still lit, albeit faintly, when the body was discovered. Was anything found in the ashes? Lestrade looked surprised. Not that I'm aware of, Holmes. My men did a cursory check, but mostly for discarded weapons or notes. Nothing significant was reported. Holmes merely tooted softly, a gesture of mild disapproval. He knelt, taking a small, finely bristled brush and a scoop from his ever-present toolkit. With painstaking care, he began to sift through the cold ashes in the hearth. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint scraping sound of his brush. After a few tense minutes, he stopped. Just as I suspected. He held up the scoop. Nestled among the gray ash were several small, charred fragments. They were mostly unidentifiable, but one piece was distinct enough to catch my eye, a tiny, partially burned piece of what looked like embossed paper, with a faint, almost illegible symbol. What is it, Holmes? I asked, leaning closer. Remnants of something burned in haste. Watson, he replied, carefully transferring the fragments to another evidence envelope. And the symbol, it's a coat of arms, or perhaps a family crest. Burned, but still recognizable to a discerning eye. Not Lady Beatrice's, I can't assure you. Lestrade rubbed his chin, looking perplexed. So, someone burned documents here, after the deed? Or perhaps just before or during. The timing is crucial, Holmes mused. But the key is that these fragments, along with our luminous particles and the peculiar scent on the rose, are beginning to paint a picture of our murderer. A person who was not only present, but also left behind a trail, however subtle. He then turned his attention back to the drawing room as a whole. His gaze swept over the luxurious furnishings, the valuable paintings, and finally settled on a large, intricately carved wooden chest in the corner, obviously an antique. Lestrade. Holmes pointed to the chest. Has this been opened or examined? It's locked, Holmes, Lestrade replied. We presumed it was an ornamental piece, likely containing linens or old papers. Not relevant to the case, as the killer didn't appear to be after valuables. On the contrary, Lestrade, Holmes corrected him gently, a hint of his characteristic superiority in his voice. In a case of murder, everything is relevant, especially things that are deliberately locked away, or in this instance, appear to have been tampered with. He strode towards the chest, and to our surprise, he didn't try to force it open. Instead, he knelt and carefully examined the base of the chest, particularly the floor beneath it. He pointed to a faint, barely visible scratch on the polished wooden floorboards, partially obscured by the shadow of the chest. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said, his voice now crisp with discovery. "A fresh scratch. Very fine, very deliberate. The kind of mark left by a heavy object being dragged, ever so slightly, and then pushed back into its original position. This chest, Lestrade, was not locked when our culprit arrived. It was opened, perhaps hastily, and then secured after the fact. The implication hung in the air. The killer might not only have gained access to the house, but also to the contents of the locked chest, and then painstakingly tried to conceal their actions. The plot was thickening, and Holmes was clearly enjoying every twist. Lestrade, his expression having shifted from bewildered to astonished, hurried towards the chest. "Moved, Holmes? But why? And what could be inside?" "That is precisely what we are about to discover," Holmes said, his eyes focused on the chest's intricate lock. It was no simple latch, but a complex mechanism demanding a specific key. Perhaps something more valuable than money or jewels, or something the killer did not want anyone to find. He examined the lock carefully. There were no signs of crude forcing. This further solidified the theory that the culprit was either familiar with Lady Beatrice or had somehow acquired the key. "Any keys found on Lady Beatrice, Lestrade?" Holmes inquired. Lestrade shook his head. "Only a small set for her bedroom and wardrobe. No key matches this chest." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Then this key is elsewhere, either taken by the culprit or hidden in a place we have yet to discover." He straightened up, surveying the room once more. "Watson, do you see any place in this room where a small object could be cleverly concealed?" I scanned the room, trying to put myself in the position of someone wishing to hide something important. Behind the sofa, under the rug, behind a painting, but all seemed too obvious. Holmes turned back to the writing desk. He did not look at the drawers, nor at the items on the surface. Instead, he ran his fingers along the underside of the desk, tracing the intricate wood carvings. I saw him pause at one point, an almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. He pressed lightly. A faint click echoed. A small, perfectly disguised drawer slid open from beneath the desk. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay an antique, exquisitely carved key, along with a small, rolled-up piece of paper. "Brilliant, Holmes!" I exclaimed. "Elementary, Watson," he replied, presenting the key and the paper. "A wealthy and cautious woman like Lady Beatrice would never leave such an important key in an easily discoverable place. And to a sophisticated mind, the safest place is often the one least noticed, right under one's nose, disguised as part of the furniture." Holmes unrolled the paper. Only a few words were hastily scrawled in a hurried hand. "The truth will be revealed. Do not trust." He squinted, rereading it, then looked at Lestrade. "A final message, Lestrade. A warning, or a confession. But about what, and from whom? We shall find out when we open this chest." With the key in hand, Holmes approached the wooden chest. The air in the room became thick with suffocating tension. I had a feeling that, within that chest, lay not just a secret, but the key to unlocking this entire horrific case. With a deliberate motion, Holmes inserted the ancient key into the lock of the wooden chest. A soft click echoed, surprisingly loud in the hushed room, and the heavy lid slowly lifted. Both Lestrade and I leaned forward, our anticipation palpable. Inside, resting on faded silk lining, was not gold or jewels, but a meticulously organized collection of papers and small, leather-bound diaries. The air that wafted up from the chest carried the faint scent of old parchment and dried lavender. Holmes carefully picked up the topmost item, a thick red leather diary. He opened it, his eyes quickly scanning the elegant handwriting within. These appear to be Lady Beatrice's personal journals, he announced, spanning many years by the looks of it. He then picked up a bundle of letters, tied neatly with a ribbon, and correspondence. Most of it seems to be from the past decade or so. Ah, and here we have something of interest. He pulled out a slightly thicker envelope, distinct from the others. It was unsealed and contained several sheets of paper covered in an unfamiliar, somewhat aggressive script. "What is it, Holmes?" Lestrade asked, peering over his shoulder. "A series of letters from a Mr. Elias Thorne," Holmes replied, his voice taking on a sharper edge, dating back approximately 3 months. "The tone is rather demanding, I observe, and the subject matter appears to be a rather contentious land dispute involving a property in Kent, coincidentally. The same Kent from our analysis on the Black Rose's scent." My mind immediately flashed back to Holmes's earlier deduction about the chemical scent on the Black Rose, potentially linked to a specific type of soil or a plant. The coincidence of Kent being mentioned twice in such a short span was not lost on me. A land dispute? I mused aloud. Could this be connected to the motive? Perhaps a desperate individual with something to gain from Lady Beatrice's death. A possibility, Watson, Holmes acknowledged, but we must not jump to conclusions. However, Mr. Thorne certainly seems to have had a grievance. These letters speak of threats, of exposing certain truths if Lady Beatrice did not comply with his demands. Holmes then read aloud a particular passage. "If you do not yield, Lady Beatrice, then the black stain on your family name will be unveiled, and your carefully constructed world will crumble to dust." A chill went down my spine. The black stain and the black rose, Holmes? Could it be a symbolic message? "Indeed, Watson," Holmes agreed, a thoughtful look on his face. "A distinct possibility. And the urgency implied in that note we found with the key. The truth will be revealed. Do not trust. It resonates with the tone of these letters." Lestrade's eyes widened. "Elias Thorne? I know that name. He's a notoriously litigious man, always in court over some boundary line or inheritance. He owns an estate not far from Lady Beatrice's country home. This is a solid lead, Holmes." Holmes, however, held up a hand. "A lead, Lestrade, but not yet a conclusion. Motive and opportunity are present, certainly. But what are the means? And the intricate details we've already uncovered, the luminous fragments, the burned crest, the hidden key, do they all align perfectly with Mr. Thorne?" He paused, his gaze returning to the diary. "I believe the answer to that lies within Lady Beatrice's own words. Perhaps she feared him, or perhaps she feared something else entirely." The complexity of the case was deepening. We now had a potential suspect and a motive, but Holmes's insistence on aligning all the minute details suggested there was far more to this black stain than met the eye. Holmes carefully set aside the letters from Elias Thorne and picked up the red leather diary once more. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning dates and entries with astonishing speed. His methods were always a blend of meticulous observation and intuitive leaps. "These entries cover the past year," Holmes noted, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Lady Beatrice meticulously documented her daily life, her social engagements, and her more private thoughts. Ah, here we are." He stopped at an entry dated just 2 weeks prior. He began to read aloud, his voice low and clear. "October 27th. A most unsettling visit from Elias Thorne. His demands grow bolder, his threats more thinly veiled. He spoke again of that secret, the one my late husband so desperately tried to bury. He hinted that he possesses proof, a document that would shatter our family's reputation if it ever saw the light of day. I offered him money, a substantial sum, but he merely smiled that cold, reptilian smile and said, 'Some truths are beyond monetary value, Lady Beatrice. They demand their just exposure.' I am filled with a dreadful premonition." A collective gasp escaped Lestrade's lips. Proof of a secret? A family reputation at stake? This Thorne is a blackmailer, Holmes, and Lady Beatrice was clearly terrified of him. "Indeed, Lestrade. The plot thickens," Holmes agreed, though his expression remained unreadable. He turned a few more pages, his gaze intense. And here, an entry from yesterday, the very day of her demise. He continued to read. November 15th. The day has finally come. Thorne insisted on meeting this evening. He claims he will present his irrefutable evidence tonight. My heart is heavy with dread. I have prepared the money, as he demanded a second time, but I fear it will not be enough to silence him for good. The shame, the profound shame if it were to be revealed. I have placed the money aside. What a fool I was to believe I could buy his silence indefinitely. I only pray George will be vigilant this evening. My one hope now rests on the swift action of my solicitor, Mr. Henderson. The words hung in the air, heavy with Lady Beatrice's fear and desperation. The pieces were starting to fit, forming a chilling narrative. Elias Thorne had demanded a meeting, was likely the recipient of the £200, and clearly possessed a secret that could ruin Lady Beatrice. So, Thorne was here last night, Lestrade exclaimed, slamming his fist into his palm. He met her, presented his evidence, and when she couldn't meet his demands, or perhaps threatened to expose him, he murdered her. The black rose was his twisted symbol for the black stain on her family. Holmes slowly closed a diary, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. A compelling theory, Lestrade. It certainly aligns with the general sequence of events and the nature of the blackmail. Thorne had motive, and the opportunity for a meeting was confirmed. But Holmes held up a finger. It does not explain all the evidence we have uncovered. What do you mean, Holmes? I asked, feeling a prickle of unease. The case seems so clear now. The luminous fragments, Watson, Holmes reminded us. The burned crest, the peculiar chemical scent on the rose, and the fact that the money was prepared, but whether it was exchanged remains unknown. While Mr. Thorne is undeniably embroiled in this tragedy, we must not be hasty. The devil, as they say, is in the details, and our details suggest a more complex picture than a simple blackmail-turned-murder. Holmes's words cast a shadow of doubt over Lestrade's seemingly perfect conclusion. There were still elements that didn't quite fit, nuances only Holmes seemed to perceive. The true killer and the full extent of the black stain remained elusive. Holmes placed the diary back into the chest, a look of deep concentration on his face. He walked slowly back towards the body of Lady Beatrice, his gaze once again sweeping the room, as if searching for a phantom detail. Lestrade, though frustrated by Holmes's reluctance to immediately conclude on Thorne, remained silent, accustomed to the detective's unique process. The money, Holmes finally mused aloud, addressing no one in particular. Lady Beatrice clearly stated she had placed the money aside for Thorne. Yet, we found no large sum here, nor any sign that it was forcibly taken after her death. Perhaps Thorne took it, Holmes, before he fled, Lestrade offered. A possibility, yes, but if he did so without disturbing anything else, which seems unlikely for a man who has just committed such a brutal act and is in a hurry to escape. More importantly, Watson, you examined the body. Were there any signs of struggle? Any defensive wounds? I shook my head. None, Holmes. Aside from the fatal wound, her hands were unmarked, her clothes unrumpled. It suggests the attack was swift and entirely unexpected, or that she was somehow incapacitated beforehand. Precisely, Holmes affirmed. And this brings us back to the luminous fragments and the chemical scent on the rose. Neither of these seems directly consistent with a desperate blackmailer like Thorne. His methods, as described in these letters, are more blunt, less theatrical. He returned to the black rose, still lying near the body. He picked it up with the tweezers once more and brought it close to his eyes. The scent, Watson. It is indeed a chemical, but it is not a dye. It is something else. Something used for preservation, perhaps. Or for illumination. My mind raced. Illumination? What could that mean? Holmes then turned his attention to the large, ornate chandelier hanging above the center of the drawing room. Its crystals sparkled, reflecting the dim light of the gas lamps. Lestrade, Holmes asked, pointing upwards, what time were the gas lamps in this room lit yesterday evening? Lestrade checked his notes. George, the footman, reported lighting them at precisely 6 o'clock, as per Lady Beatrice's instructions. He then left the room and only returned to secure the house later. And the chandelier? Holmes continued. Is it purely ornamental, or does it also contain gas jets? It has gas jets, Holmes, Lestrade confirmed, but Lady Beatrice rarely used them. She preferred the softer glow of the wall sconces and the fireplace. They were not lit last night, according to George. Holmes's eyes twinkled with a newfound insight. Ah, but I believe they were Lestrade, or at least an attempt was made to light them. Watson observed the small brass lever on the wall near the fireplace, the one that controls the main gas flow to the chandelier. I looked, and indeed, there was a small, almost unnoticeable lever. What about it, Holmes? It is slightly ajar, Watson, not fully closed, nor fully open. And if one were to examine it closely, Holmes said, leaning in and using his magnifying glass, one would see a faint smudge. Not dust, but a residue. A residue that, I dare say, matches the luminous fragments we found on the rug. A gasp escaped me. The luminous fragments. They weren't just random debris. They were linked to the gas lighting. Someone tried to light the chandelier, or at least tampered with its controls, Holmes deduced, his voice rising with conviction. And in doing so, they left behind these unique particles. Particles that are, in fact, not glass, but a specialized igniting compound used in certain early, experimental forms of self-lighting gas lamps. A very rare and distinctive substance, not found in common households. The room fell silent as we all processed this revelation. The luminous fragments, the attempt to light the chandelier, and the unusual chemical on the black rose. These were all pieces of a puzzle that pointed away from the crude methods of Elias Thorne. So, the killer was not only in the house, but also attempted to use a specific, rare method of lighting, I murmured. This changes everything. Holmes gave a rare, triumphant smile. Indeed, Watson. It suggests a killer with a particular, perhaps even scientific, inclination. Someone who possesses knowledge of such obscure compounds. And it tells us that our murderer was not merely a brute, but a calculating individual who perhaps misjudged the sophistication of their own method, leaving behind these crucial signatures. The case, which had seemed to point so strongly to Elias Thorne, now swung in an entirely new, unsettling direction. The mystery of the black rose was far from solved. Holmes stood by the chandelier lever, his eyes shining with intellectual excitement. The revelation about the igniting compound had clearly redirected his entire line of inquiry. Lestrade, though still grappling with the shift in focus, listened intently. Consider, Lestrade, Holmes articulated, the type of individual who would possess such a substance and know how to use it. This is not common knowledge. We're looking for someone with an interest in, or perhaps a profession involving, experimental chemistry, gas technology, or perhaps even stagecraft, where such special effects might be employed. He then returned to the black rose. He delicately picked it up again with his tweezers, examining it once more. And the chemical scent on the rose, Watson. It is subtle but distinctive. Combined with the igniting compound, it suggests a particular atmosphere. Perhaps the killer used it to mask the natural scent of the rose, or perhaps it was simply an incidental byproduct of their other activities. Holmes then walked towards the fireplace, where he had found the charred fragments. He held them up, specifically the piece with the faint crest. And these, the remnants of a burned crest. What sort of family would choose to have such a crest, and why would it be burned in haste, yet deliberately, by the killer? Lestrade, eager to contribute, finally had a thought. Holmes, if the killer had some connection to chemistry or gas, what about the gas company? Or perhaps a university professor? Possible, Lestrade, but too broad. Holmes dismissed gently. We need something more precise. Let us consider the black rose itself. It is a symbol, as we agreed, a black stain on a family. But why this particular flower? Is there a family in London known for its cultivation of roses? Or perhaps a family whose crest incorporates a rose motif, even if it's not black? He paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind visibly racing through possibilities. The black rose, the unique chemical scent, the experimental igniting compound, the burned family crest, and the carefully hidden transaction money for a blackmail. These are disparate elements, yet they must connect. Our killer is not merely a common criminal, but an individual with specific knowledge and a profound, perhaps even personal, connection to Lady Beatrice and the secret Elias Thorne was blackmailing her over. But who Holmes? I pressed. Who fits such an unusual profile? Holmes paused, his gaze fixed on a small, framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It showed a young, handsome man in academic robes, standing beside Lady Beatrice, both smiling. Ah, Holmes murmured, a new glint in his eye. A very intriguing photograph, Watson. This young man. He bears a striking resemblance to Lady Beatrice. Her nephew, perhaps, and, judging by his attire, a scholar, possibly a chemist, or someone involved in the sciences at one of our prestigious universities. Lestrade peered at the photograph. That's Alastair Fairfax, Lady Beatrice's only nephew. A brilliant young man, I hear. A professor of chemistry at King's College. He inherited a substantial amount from his father, Lady Beatrice's late brother, Alastair Fairfax. The name hung in the air, suddenly imbued with a chilling significance. A brilliant young chemist, potentially with access to unusual compounds, a family connection, and an inheritance that might be tied to Lady Beatrice's secret. The pieces were beginning to align, not with Elias Thorne, but with a figure far closer to the victim. Professor Alastair Fairfax, Holmes repeated slowly, a dangerous gleam in his eyes. A man of science, impeccable reputation, and precisely the kind of individual who might employ subtle, sophisticated means to commit a crime and leave behind clues so unique, only a truly observant I would ever notice them. Our black stain might run deeper and closer to home than we first imagined. The very idea was shocking. Could Lady Beatrice's own brilliant nephew be capable of such a heinous act? The implication was unsettling, yet it fit Holmes's intricate web of evidence. Holmes turned from the photograph, his eyes now alight with a cold, analytical fire. The shift in his demeanor was always a signal that he had formulated a theory and was now ready to articulate it with unshakable logic. Lestrade, Watson, Holmes began, his voice crisp and authoritative. We have been led astray by the obvious. Elias Thorne, while clearly a blackmailer and a man of ill repute, does not fully fit the profile of our killer. His methods are crude. The evidence at hand is anything but. He gestured around the room. Consider the precise, almost surgical nature of the wound, suggesting a steady hand. The luminous, igniting compound, pointing to someone with specialized knowledge of chemistry or experimental gas technology. The unique chemical scent on the black rose, possibly a byproduct of a specific process. And most significantly, the meticulous efforts to conceal the crime. The lack of forced entry, the relocked chest, and the small, deliberate scratch on the floorboards, suggesting a perpetrator who was calm and calculating, not panicked. But Alastair Fairfax, Lestrade interjected, still struggling with the implications. A man of his standing? A university professor? Precisely, Lestrade. And those very qualities make him a more formidable, and often more dangerous, criminal, Holmes countered. A man whose intellect allows him to devise a complex scheme, and whose social standing provides a perfect veneer of innocence. Holmes continued, building his case. Lady Beatrice's diary entries state she was being blackmailed over a secret that would shatter their family's reputation. And she explicitly mentioned her nephew, Alastair, inheriting a substantial amount from his father. What if that secret, the black stain, directly impacted Alastair's inheritance or his own reputation? What if Elias Thorne's blackmail targeted not just Lady Beatrice, but the very foundation of Alastair's position? The money, I added, seeing where he was going. The 200 pounds. Lady Beatrice prepared it for Thorne. Indeed, but it vanished. If Thorne took it, why did he leave the black rose and the burned crest? If Alastair took it, It would make sense for him to eliminate both the blackmailer and the source of the secret, Holmes explained. My theory, then, is this. Alistair Fairfax, aware of Thorne's blackmail and perhaps even the contents of the secret in the chest, decided to take matters into his own hands. He arranged to meet Thorne here, yesterday evening, perhaps to negotiate or to intercept the incriminating evidence Thorne possessed. Holmes's eyes narrowed. However, something went awry. Perhaps Thorne refused to yield, or perhaps Alistair saw an opportunity to silence both Thorne and Lady Beatrice, thereby permanently burying the family secret and securing his own future without threat. The money, I suspect, was a red herring. It was prepared for Thorne, but never exchanged. It merely served as a convenient justification for a meeting. So, Alistair killed Lady Beatrice to prevent the secret from coming out and to eliminate Thorne's blackmail, possibly even taking the incriminating evidence from Thorne's possession. Lestrade pieced together, a dawning horror in his eyes. That is my working hypothesis, Holmes confirmed. And Alistair, being a man of science, used his specialized knowledge to craft a subtly sinister message with the black rose and the unique chemical scent, and perhaps even attempted to use the gas lighting in some capacity, perhaps to create a distraction or even to disguise the time of death by altering the room's conditions. The burned crest? Possibly Thorne's, or something Thorne brought, which Alistair destroyed to remove another piece of evidence. But how do we prove it, Holmes? I asked. He's a respected figure. Holmes's smile was grim. By finding the missing pieces, Watson. The precise nature of the black stain itself, the full extent of Alistair's involvement, and, most importantly, the whereabouts of Elias Thorne. For if Alistair eliminated Lady Beatrice to silence the blackmailer, then where is the blackmailer now? I suspect Mr. Thorne is either dead or being held captive, and Alistair Fairfax, professor of chemistry, is our prime suspect. The cold precision of Holmes's logic was chilling. He had transformed a seemingly straightforward case into a tangled web of family secrets, blackmail, and a brilliant, calculating murderer. Holmes mused for a moment, his eyes scanning the room's paintings and furnishings as if mapping out a plan in his mind. Lestrade and I waited, entirely captivated by the sharpness of his deductions. We must act swiftly and discreetly, Holmes finally stated, his voice full of resolve. First, Lestrade, you must immediately dispatch men to Elias Thorne's estate in Kent. Search every corner. I suspect that Thorne is either no longer alive, or at the very least, not free. If Alistair moved against Lady Beatrice to silence the blackmailer, leaving Thorne alive would be too great a risk. Lestrade nodded rapidly, immediately pulling out his notebook to jot down instructions. I'll dispatch my best men at once, Holmes. Good, Holmes continued. Meanwhile, Watson and I will pay a personal visit to Professor Alistair Fairfax at King's College. We will not accuse him outright. Instead, we will pose a few questions, present some of the pieces of evidence we've collected, and observe his reactions. A sophisticated criminal mind often reveals subtle cracks when cornered. Do you think he'll confess? I asked, a touch of skepticism in my voice. Holmes gave a faint smile. No, Watson, he will not confess, but he will react. And it is in those reactions, those telling words and actions, that the truth will emerge. Furthermore, I want us to take the luminous fragments we found. Let us see a chemist's reaction when confronted with something he believed was perfectly concealed. What about the secret Thorne was blackmailing Lady Beatrice over? Lestrade inquired. We need to know what it is to fully understand the motive. Precisely. And I believe the answer lies within this chest, Holmes said, indicating the now open chest. Lady Beatrice clearly kept all pertinent evidence regarding that secret here. We will scrutinize the remaining diaries and correspondence later. The plan was clearly laid out. Lestrade quickly departed, carrying Holmes's urgent directives to Scotland Yard. I and Holmes prepared for our journey to King's College, a visit that could entirely shift the dynamics of the case. On the way there, Holmes, who had remained silent for the entire journey, suddenly spoke as our hansom cab passed a florist's shop. Watson, that black rose. It's not just a symbol. It's a piece of a lie, and I believe I now understand its true significance. I looked at him, awaiting an explanation, but Holmes merely winked. Patience, Watson. All will be revealed. My curiosity surged. What about the Black Rose had Holmes discovered? And could we truly confront Alistair Fairfax, a man of such high repute, and force him to betray himself? The impending confrontation was sure to be dramatic. The hansom cab deposited us outside the imposing gates of King's College. The architectural grandeur of the university seemed to mock the dark undercurrents of murder and blackmail we carried with us. Professor Alistair Fairfax's laboratory was located in a modern wing, a stark contrast to the ancient stone buildings. We found Alistair within, a man in his late 30s, with an intelligent, almost severe face framed by neatly parted dark hair. He was meticulously cleaning various glass beakers, his white lab coat spotless. When he saw us, a flicker of surprise, quickly masked, crossed his features. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." Alistair greeted us, his voice calm and cultured. "To what do I owe the unexpected pleasure? I trust this isn't about some misplaced manuscript." "On the contrary, Professor Fairfax," Holmes replied, his gaze unwavering. "Our visit concerns a matter of far greater gravity. We are investigating the tragic demise of your aunt, Lady Beatrice." Alistair's face immediately fell, adopting a look of appropriate sorrow. "Ah, yes, a dreadful business. My poor aunt. Lestrade informed me this morning. I'm still quite shaken. I adored her, you know, a truly remarkable woman." "Indeed," Holmes said, his voice flat. "And remarkably, she was being blackmailed by a man named Elias Thorne." Alistair flinched almost imperceptibly at the mention of Thorne's name, but quickly recovered. "Thorne? Yes, I was aware of him. A persistent nuisance, always hounding my aunt over some trivial land dispute. A rather unsavory character, wouldn't you agree? Unsavory, perhaps, but capable of murder." Holmes pressed, his eyes fixed on Alistair. I suppose anyone is capable of anything, given enough desperation," Alistair replied, his voice losing a touch of its earlier composure. He turned back to his beakers, his movements becoming slightly less fluid. "Professor Fairfax," Holmes continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "we have reason to believe that Thorne's blackmail was not merely about land. It concerned a black stain on the Fairfax family name. A secret, perhaps one that could affect your own standing or even your inheritance." Alistair's hand, holding a test tube, trembled slightly. "Nonsense. My family has no such secrets, and my inheritance is quite secure." "And the Black Rose, Professor?" Holmes asked, his voice now like a rapier thrust. He produced the small evidence envelope containing the luminous fragments and the Black Rose. "Found by your aunt's body." "And this," Holmes tapped the envelope. "These glittering particles were found near the gas chandelier, a rare, igniting compound. A substance, I dare say, a skilled chemist such as yourself might possess, or at least be intimately familiar with." Alistair's composure finally began to crack. His eyes darted from Holmes to the envelope, then back to the beakers on his bench. A bead of sweat formed on his temple. "What are you implying, Mr. Holmes? Are you suggesting that I had anything to do with my aunt's death?" His voice was higher now, tinged with a nervous edge. "I am merely presenting facts, Professor," Holmes said calmly, but the weight of his words was crushing. "Facts that suggest a killer with a very specific set of knowledge, and a motive that extends far beyond a simple land dispute." Alistair took a deep, shaky breath, his gaze momentarily falling on a large, sealed glass container on a nearby shelf, filled with a dark, rich soil. My eyes followed his instinctively. "And finally, Professor," Holmes concluded, his voice delivering the final blow, "we have just received word from Inspector Lestrade. Elias Thorne's estate has been thoroughly searched. Mr. Thorne is nowhere to be found. However, within his study, a note was discovered. A note stating he was to meet Lady Beatrice at her home last night to deliver certain documents regarding the true heritage of the Fairfax lineage, and that he would be accompanied by a discreet associate. The color drained from Alistair's face. The mention of discreet associate and true heritage had clearly struck a nerve far deeper than any prior accusation. The mask of sorrow and composure completely shattered, revealing a raw, desperate fear. The truth was within reach. Alistair Fairfax, the esteemed professor, was cornered. Alistair Fairfax's face was a mask of terror, his carefully constructed facade having crumbled completely. His eyes darted wildly, seeking an escape that wasn't there. He gripped the edge of his lab bench, knuckles white. The discreet associate? Alistair stammered, his voice barely a whisper. What did the note say? It spoke of a witness, Professor. Holmes pressed, his voice relentless. Someone who could corroborate Thorne's claims about the true heritage of the Fairfax lineage. Someone who would ensure Thorne's evidence, if anything were to happen to him, would still see the light of day. Holmes's gaze was piercing, boring into Alistair's very soul. No, that's impossible. Alistair gasped, shaking his head frantically. He couldn't have. He wouldn't dare. But he did, Professor, Holmes stated, a chilling calm in his tone. Thorne was a shrewd man. He anticipated betrayal. He knew that the black stain was so profound, so damaging, that some would go to extreme lengths to suppress it. And you, Professor, were precisely that person. Alistair staggered back, knocking over a flask that clattered to the floor, spilling its clear contents. His carefully maintained laboratory, a symbol of his ordered mind, was now mirroring his internal chaos. I had no choice. Alistair finally burst out, his voice hoarse with desperation, all pretense of innocence abandoned. That man, Thorne, he was going to expose everything. He had proof, irrefutable proof that my father, Lady Beatrice's own brother, was not a true Fairfax. He was the illegitimate son of a stable hand. My entire inheritance, my name, my reputation, all built on a lie. The revelation was staggering. The black stain was not a minor scandal, but a foundational lie that threatened to dismantle Alistair's entire existence. And Lady Beatrice, I prompted gently, she knew the truth? Alistair's eyes filled with tears, a mixture of rage and grief. She did. She tried to protect us, to buy Thorne's silence. But he was insatiable. He demanded to meet last night, to present the evidence to her, and to secure a final, enormous payment. And he brought a witness. Who was the witness, Professor? Holmes asked, his voice sharp. Alistair looked down, shame etched on his face. George, the footman. He was Thorne's accomplice, the one who truly orchestrated this. Thorne had discovered the secret, but George, knowing the household and my aunt's habits, helped him plan the blackmail. He was supposed to stay hidden, a silent observer, ready to step forward if Thorne's demands weren't met. So, what transpired, Professor? Holmes urged, piecing together the final, horrific moments. I confronted Thorne alone in the drawing room. Alistair confessed, his voice trembling. I offered him the £200, just as my aunt had prepared. But he laughed. He said it was only a down payment. He then revealed the documents, my father's true birth certificate, forged marriage papers, damning letters. And he threatened to release it all to the press that very night if I didn't agree to his new demands. And Lady Beatrice? I asked, dreading the answer. She heard us. Alistair sobbed. She came into the room. She saw the documents. The shock. It was too much for her. She collapsed. And in that moment of chaos, Thorne, seeing his leverage vanish, lunged at the documents. I had a small, sharp letter opener on the desk. I don't know why, but I grabbed it. I wanted to stop him from taking the proof, to protect my family's last shred of dignity. I struck out. His voice broke. It was an accident, Mr. Holmes. I never meant to kill her. It was dark, and I was frantic to stop Thorne. I only meant to hit his arm, to make him drop the papers, but she was in the way. She collapsed right into my path, and the blade went to her throat. The gruesome truth, at last, spilled from his lips. Lady Beatrice was not the primary target. but a tragic casualty of a desperate man trying to bury a devastating family secret. But the black rose, the luminous fragments, there were still missing pieces. And the black rose, Professor? Holmes asked, his voice calm, even as Alistair wept. And the igniting compound? And where is Elias Thorne now? Alistair looked up, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. After my aunt fell, George, the footman, emerged. He saw everything. He said he would tell the authorities unless I helped him make it look like a simple robbery, or at least make it impossible to trace back to him. He was the one who insisted on the black rose, a symbol, he said, of the death of a secret. He helped me relock the chest, move things around. He knew I had the igniting compound in my coat pocket from an experiment earlier in the day. He used it, he said, to try and mask the sin of the crime, to confuse anyone investigating, and he took Thorne. The full horror of the conspiracy and the extent of George's involvement now became terrifyingly clear. Alistair Fairfax, broken and defeated, sat slumped on a laboratory stool, his confession hanging heavy in the air. The esteemed professor, a man of science and intellect, had been driven to a desperate act by the fear of a devastating secret. So, George, the footman, was Thorne's true accomplice from the start. Holmes summarized, his voice devoid of emotion, merely stating facts. He knew the house, its routines, and your aunt's habits, providing Thorne with the means to infiltrate and blackmail. And after Lady Beatrice's accidental death, he seized the opportunity to further his own agenda by implicating you and disposing of Thorne. Yes, Alistair whispered, his head in his hands. He said he would ensure I wasn't implicated, but only if I helped him get rid of Thorne and the evidence. He took the documents, my father's true birth certificate, everything. And he took Thorne's body. He told me he knew a way to make both disappear without a trace. And the black rose? I asked, recalling Holmes's earlier pronouncement. George brought it, Alistair explained. He said it was the death of a secret. He instructed me to leave it by her hand. The chemical scent on it, it was his idea. He said it would confuse investigators. He saw me with the igniting compound from my lab and suggested I use it near the gas lamp, again, to create confusion. Holmes nodded slowly. The igniting compound, as I suspected, was not a deliberate attempt to light the chandelier, but a desperate, clumsy attempt to throw us off the scent, using a substance the perpetrator knew you, Professor, possessed. The chemical on the rose was likely a common disinfectant from the servants' quarters, masked by the rose's natural fragrance and intended to mislead us further. In Thorne's body, Lestrade's voice boomed as he re-entered the lab, having returned from his urgent dispatch. My men searched Thorne's estate top to bottom. Nothing. He's vanished into thin air. He hasn't vanished, Lestrade, Holmes said, a glint in his eye. He has been disposed of, and I dare say his discreet associate knows precisely where. George, the footman, is our true quarry now. He orchestrated this entire scheme, from the blackmail to the cover-up. But how do we find him, Holmes? He's likely fled. Lestrade exclaimed, exasperated. Not yet, Lestrade. Holmes replied with a confident smile. George, the footman, is cunning, but he is also a creature of habit. He is too confident in his own cleverness. He believes he has covered his tracks perfectly. He would not flee without first ensuring the full fruits of his labor. The incriminating documents are safely in his possession or destroyed. And he certainly wouldn't leave his last accomplice, Professor Fairfax, alive to tell the tale without a contingency plan. He is still within the immediate vicinity, either hiding or preparing his final move. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the floor below, followed by a frantic shout. That, Holmes stated, his eyes narrowing, would be George. He has clearly heard our discussion, Professor Fairfax's confession, and is now attempting to make his final, desperate escape. Lestrade, secure Alistair. Watson with me. We raced downstairs, following the sounds of a struggle. George, the footman, a man we had dismissed as a mere servant, was indeed attempting to flee through a back service entrance, clutching a small, leather-bound satchel. He fought with surprising ferocity, but Lestrade's men, alerted by the commotion and guided by Holmes's instincts, quickly overwhelmed and apprehended him. In the satchel, Holmes found the damning documents, Thorne's original blackmail evidence, a faded, undeniable birth certificate proving Lady Beatrice's brother, Alistair's father, was indeed the illegitimate son of a stable hand. Along with it, a detailed confession from George, outlining his role in discovering the secret, partnering with Thorne, and his ultimate plan to frame Alistair and seize the documents for his own future blackmail schemes. He had, as Alistair confessed, disposed of Thorne's body in an abandoned well on a remote part of Thorne's estate, a place Lestrade's initial search had overlooked. The mystery of the Black Rose was finally solved. The Black Rose, Alistair's accidental weapon, the igniting compound, the chemical scent, the burned crest, all were threads in a complex tapestry woven by greed, desperation, and a meticulously hidden secret. Lady Beatrice Fairfax, a victim of circumstance, and Alistair Fairfax, a victim of fear, had both fallen prey to the machinations of a truly sinister mind. Elementary, my dear Watson, Holmes concluded as George was led away, his face contorted with impotent rage. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to blossom, even if it is as dark as a black rose.